The wagon appeared at the end of the road just after 7, when the frost was still thick on the grass and the light was coming sideways across the north field, pale and flat. She had seen it turn off the main road from the rise behind the granary. She was already at the fence when it came into view, her hands around a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The fence post under her elbow was solid. She had replaced 4 of them herself in September, working the bar alone in ground that had started to freeze at the edges, her breath coming out in short white bursts in the cold morning air. She watched the wagon come. The man driving it sat very straight. He had written first, which she had appreciated. She had read the letter twice and set it on the table and left it there for 3 days. Then she had written back, "I will hear what you have to say." That was all. She had not told anyone she had written it. There was no one to tell. The north field was behind her, pale and waiting. The wheat had been cut in August, and the stubble still stood in rows, pale gold against the frozen ground. Beyond the field, the second granary she had raised in the spring of the second years. 6 days of work with 2 hired men from Milford and 1 from across the creek who had shown up without asking and stayed until it was done. The wagon slowed at the gate. She did not move toward it. She had come to Carlow Flats in November of the first year, on a train that smelled of wet wool and coal smoke. She was 31 years old and had made this kind of journey before. The kind where you watch the land change outside the window and try to calculate what is waiting at the other end. Her brother had written in October, not a long letter. He had never been a man who used more words than he needed. The operation was not managing. He was not managing. He needed someone who knew figures and did not panic. He had thought of her. She had left Ontario with 1 trunk and enough money to matter, watching the shield give way to the flat land of the prairies, the sky opening up around her in a way that felt less like space and more like exposure. There was nowhere to hide from that kind of sky. She had decided, somewhere around Portage la Prairie, that this was not a problem she intended to have. The platform at Milford was not empty when she arrived. Small places have a way of knowing when something worth watching is coming in on the afternoon train. She stepped down into the cold and stood for a moment while her eyes adjusted to the thin November light. He was at the far end of the platform. She saw him before he saw her. He had lost weight since their mother's funeral 3 years prior, and he stood with the careful stillness of a man who has learned not to move quickly because moving quickly costs something. He was 44 years old, and he looked older. She walked to him. He said her name. "You look like you need to sit down," she said. "I'm all right." "I didn't say you weren't." Something moved across his face that might have been relief. He picked up her bag without being asked, and she followed him to the wagon, and the cold came up through her boots, and she did not break her stride. The operation was in worse shape than the letter had prepared her for. She understood this within the first hour. The main building stood, but the east wall had settled over the winter, and the door no longer hung square. The small granary had a soft section in the floor she found by stepping through it. Not far enough to fall, but far enough to know. The equipment shed held a grain auger with a bent flight, a seeder with a cracked frame, and 1 cultivator that appeared to be in working order. The second granary existed only in the sense that the foundation posts were there. Her brother stood in the doorway of the equipment shed while she moved through it, looking at things the way she looked at things. With her eyes, without speaking. "I should have written sooner," he said. She crouched to look at the auger flight. "Where do you keep the account books?" The books were in the desk in the main building, under a land survey and a folded letter from the bank in Winnipeg. The debt was $100, accumulated over 2 seasons of short harvests and 1 season of pricing decisions she could see, reading backwards through the columns, had been made out of optimism rather than arithmetic. There was also an outstanding amount owed to the implement dealer in Milford. Not large, but real. She sat with the books open for a long time. He died on a Thursday in February, in the way that people die when illness has been patient with them for a long time. There was no last conversation she would later examine for meaning. She had been outside since before light, breaking ice from the water trough with the blunt end of a fence bar, her shoulders aching from the cold working into the joint. When she came inside, the room had the particular stillness that is different from sleep. She stood at the foot of his bed for a moment. Then she went to the window. The frost on the glass had made a pattern along the lower edge, the way frost does when there is warmth inside and cold outside, working at each other through the pane. She had noticed it that morning without thinking about it. She stood and looked at it now. Then she turned and did what came next. The solicitor's office was above the dry goods store on the main street of Milford, up a flight of stairs that creaked twice on the way up. She had never had reason to go up those stairs. She went up slowly, not from hesitation. He was a man named Donnelly, with ink-stained cuffs and the careful expression of someone who has delivered difficult news often enough to have developed a method for it. There was a document box on his desk. He opened the box, he read the lease first, then he set it down and looked at her over the papers. He said that her brother had filed an amendment to the lease agreement the previous September. Before she had arrived, before she had written back, before she had done anything at all, he had added her name, her full name, as co-holder of the operating lease on the Carlow Flats property, 320 acres, including the structures and the registered water access. She asked him to read that part again. He did. Then he set the document down in the particular way he had been preparing to set it down, and he told her about the debt. The $100 owed to the bank in Winnipeg had passed with the operation. He said this carefully, with a small pause before the number. Then he said that given the circumstances, she might consider whether a sale of the asset prior to the obligation becoming, he had a phrase for it. Untenable was the word he used. She waited until he finished the sentence. Then she asked for a copy of the lease. He blinked. He said he could have one prepared by the following week. She said she would wait. He went to the copying press in the back room. She sat in the chair and looked at the window. The street below was quiet in the way that February streets are quiet in small towns. Not empty, just careful. A man loading a wagon. A woman coming out of the post office with her collar turned up. Donnelly came back with the copy. She folded it once lengthwise and placed it in her coat pocket. She thanked him. She stood. She went back down the stairs into the cold. She walked the 4 miles back to the property. The lease was in her pocket, and the cold was at her back, and nothing was decided yet. Spring came late that year. The creek flooded in April and took a section of fence along the east boundary, and she spent 3 days in cold mud, restringing wire from posts that were still sound, working alone because the 2 men she had hired for the season had not yet come back from Milford. She had one tenant for the north field, a farmer named Drummond who worked the quarter section to the south, and had come to her in March with his hat in his hand, the way men come when they want something and are not certain they will get it. He offered a figure for the season lease. She had listened to the figure, and then she had said, without particular heat, that the figure did not account for the water access, which was registered and which he would need. He looked at her the way men look when they have been caught in an omission they had hoped would pass unnoticed. Then he named a higher figure. She said nothing. She looked at the field. He talked. She let him talk. He came up to her number on his own, in stages, the way a man does when he wants to feel he arrived there by logic. When he reached the number she had been holding in her head, she said, "That's fine. Not yes, not thank you. Fine." He shook her hand with some surprise in his grip. The first payment came in on time. She noted it in the account book. The debt was still there. But there was also this. The summer of the second year was dry. Not a disaster. The north field held. Drummond's arrangement worked. But the pasture along the creek went to dust by July, and the 4 cattle she had kept through the winter stood in the shade of the granary in the afternoons and did not move more than they needed to. The account books were improving. Not quickly, but in the right direction. She had begun, that summer, to think about the second granary. The foundation posts were there. The lumber would cost something she did not quite have yet. She worked the numbers on 3 separate evenings at the table with a candle and the survey maps, and each time she arrived at the same conclusion. Possible by autumn of the 3rd year, if nothing went wrong. Something went wrong in August. The auger, seized during the last week of harvest, the bent flight finally giving out entirely, and the repair would cost more than she had budgeted for and take longer than she had time for. And she stood in the equipment shed, holding the piece of broken metal, working through what it meant for the season. She put the metal down and went to the main building and wrote 3 letters. One to the implement dealer in Milford about the repair cost, one to Drummond about adjusted timing on the threshing, and one to the bank in Winnipeg about the payment schedule. The letters were brief and stated the facts without apology. She sealed them and walked them to the post office herself. Then she came back and finished the harvest by hand in stages, which was slower and harder, and got done. The man from across the creek was named Tate. She had seen him twice, once at the Milford post office, once as on the road south of the property. Before the morning in October of the 2nd year, when she came outside at first light to find a wagon in the yard. He was there. He had 2 hired men with him and a load of milled lumber in the wagon bed, rough cut, still carrying the smell of fresh wood even in the October cold. He looked at the granary foundation posts. He looked at her. He said the lumber was cut from the stand his father had cleared on the west quarter, and he had more than he could use before freeze-up. He said this plainly, without preamble. She looked at the lumber. Then she said she could use it. His men unloaded it themselves. She held the door to the equipment shed open and did not help, because she was calculating, and because she did not yet know the dimensions of this offer, and did not want to be in debt to something she had not measured. Tate got back on the wagon when the lumber was off. He touched the brim of his hat. He drove back the way he had come. She stood in the yard for a moment. Then she went inside and revised her figures. The 2nd granary went up in May of the 3rd year. It took 6 days and cost her less than she had planned for. And when it was done, she stood in the doorway of it and put her hand flat on the new wood of the frame and found nothing wrong with it. She made the first debt payment in October of the 3rd year. She drove herself to Winnipeg, 2 days by wagon, 1 by train, and she walked into the bank in the same coat she had arrived in, which was a good coat, and which still was. She set the money on the counter in front of the clerk, $400. He counted it twice. He called the bank manager, which had not been necessary. The manager shook her hand with an expression she recognized. Not congratulation exactly, but something adjacent to it, with surprise underneath. She asked for a receipt. She folded it into her coat pocket. She traveled back through the night and arrived at the property before dawn, and she put the horse up and went inside and sat at the table with the account books open and looked at the figure she had crossed out, and then at the figure that remained. Then she closed the books and went to bed. In the autumn of the 3rd year, she walked the property the way she had not walked it since the 1st week. All of it. The full perimeter. Not stopping to work anything, just looking. She started at the north field at first light. Drummond had taken a 3rd season on it and had asked in June. Before she could ask him whether she wanted to continue, she had said yes before he finished the question. The field looked like a field that had been worked for 3 years by someone who cared about it. The edges clean, the drainage ditch clear, the soil turned dark by the late cover crop he had put in along the south end. She walked the fence line north and then up the rise where the cattle stood in the early cold. 7 head now, she had grown the original 4. They moved the way cattle move, without urgency, as though the grass had invited them. She came back through the granaries, both of them solid, both of them full enough. The account books in the main building showed a balance that, for the first time in 3 years, was running in the right direction without her having to calculate it daily to be certain. She went inside. She stood at the window. The frost on the glass had made the same pattern along the lower edge that it always made this time of year. She had not moved the coffee cup her brother had left on the sill. It was still there, at the same slight angle where the sill was not quite level. She had cleaned around it for 3 years. She did not think about this often, but she thought about it now. The man came on a Wednesday in late October. Good horse, brushed daily, the kind of animal that tells you something about who is caring for it. He tied it at the post and walked to the main building with his hat held at his side and his expression arranged into the patience of someone who has learned that patience reads as courtesy. He introduced himself as Haig. He said he was out of Winnipeg. He said the Canadian Pacific's freight line was extending north of the main line and that the valley's grain operations would change significantly in the next 3 to 5 years, all of which she knew, having read the same reports in the Manitoba Free Press. He said that what she had built here was remarkable. She believed he meant it, in the way men mean something true when they are about to use it as a hinge. He said that a woman alone, without family in the territory, carrying a debt that had taken years to clear, deserved the security of a clean start somewhere less isolated. He said the word security twice. He said opportunity once. Then he said the number. $5,800. He let it settle. She let it settle. Neither of them spoke for a moment. She thought of the North Field, the way the stubble looked in November light. She thought of the account books in the kitchen drawer, the figures that were finally moving the right way. She thought of the granary she had built with lumber from Tate's mill, and of the receipt from the bank in Winnipeg, folded into her coat pocket where she had kept it for a year. She said, "I appreciate the offer." He smiled. She said, "It's a fair offer." He nodded, ready. She stepped off the porch and walked toward the gate. After a moment, he followed. They walked without hurrying. The morning was clear, the light coming pale and flat across the north field the way it always did in late October. At the gate, she turned and extended her hand. He shook it, uncertain now about the direction of things. She said, "Thank you for making the trip." He began to say something about leaving the offer open, about reaching her through the post, and she listened to all of it. Then she unlatched the gate and held it while he passed through and latched it again behind him. She stood at the fence line and watched the road long after his wagon had gone quiet. The land was still after the sound of his wheels faded. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and looked out over what 3 years had made. The north field ran flat toward the tree line, pale and quiet now, but carrying the memory of last summer's wheat in the color of the turned earth. That particular dark red-brown that only comes from ground that has been worked and rested and worked again. The second granary stood solid against the morning light. The fence line on the east boundary was straight and sound, every post set to the right depth. From the rise to the north, she could see, on a clear morning, the roofline of Tate's property 2 miles east. She did not look for it. That was the thing she would have said if anyone had asked. She did not look for it. But she knew the angle of it, the low pitch of the main structure, the way the chimney held the late afternoon light a moment longer than the rest. You learn the shape of things you look at every day. That is not the same as meaning to. She turned east along the fence line and began walking. The frost was light on the ground, a thin white line along the base of each post, and it would be gone by mid-morning. The north field opened wide and pale ahead of her, the lease in the kitchen drawer with her name on it, the figures in the account books moving in the right direction, the debt nearly gone, 3 years of work standing in every post and board and granary door. She picked up her pace, turned her face into the cold morning air, and went back to work.